Hello and welcome to Beyond the Table, a show where we try and we have guests on. We talk about the history of role-playing games. We try and get information and stories and history about the games that we're playing. And a game that I love is a game called Castles and Crusades. And with me tonight is Steve Chenault of Troll Lord Games. Steve, thank you so much for joining us here tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I got a chance to talk with you at Gamehole Con, which was just a great time. And in January, we're doing a big deep dive into Castles and Crusades. But I wanted to bring you on because Castles and Crusades has been around for quite a while and has been recalled. I love this line that it's the Rosetta Stone of gaming because it
Yeah.
sort of bridges everything that kind of came before and things that are going
Right.
on now and allows you to kind of merge everything together. So let's start with how did you get into gaming?
Oh wow. We began. It will be 1975, I believe. I was like 10 years old or 9 years old or something like that. And I'm with my mother, and she's one of my father's soldiers was doing a hardship tour to Korea, and he had these little brown books that he had to get rid of because when you go on a hardship tour, you can't carry anything.
Yeah.
He knew that one of my mother's sons gamed. That was my older brother. He did a lot of wargaming, and I did a little bit of wargaming with him. You know, the old SPI and Avalon Hill
Oh
games.
yeah. Omaha
I was
Beachhead
with
still sits on my
her.
shelf.
Absolutely, Guns of August all
That's
the way.
that's right.
But so she goes down to pick up these books. They're a Christmas. They're going to be a Christmas gift or a birthday gift. I can't really remember. And I was standing there next to her when he gives her these books. Now I don't remember this part, but she said he told me, "Be careful. This can be very addictive," which is, in retrospect rather ironic.
Yeah.
But so Davis takes the books home. He kind of looks through them, can't figure out what's going on with these books and these little D&D brown books, and he puts them in a box and forgets about them. And then about 6 months to 8 months later, I don't know if he read something, saw something, picked up something, but he said he finally he went revisited them, and then we started playing. So probably in 75, 76, Davis started running me in D&D games using those little brown books. I didn't make characters. He made my characters for me. He did all that. All I did was name them. He would drop these characters on me, and I'd start just doing crazy stuff
Oh
as we
man.
tried to figure this really weird game out.
So I when I my first role playing game that I owned, not the one that I played, but the first one that I owned was Palladium Games Heroes Unlimited. And I knew that I could make characters, but I had no idea it was a game until I played in middle school in someone's game at lunchtime. It was a completely different game, a completely different system, but that's when it really clicked for me. The fact that I was like, "Oh, this is a game." And it's amazing to me how many of our early experiences are much more community based than like, reading based because
Right.
they really weren't intuitive games at the time.
No, not at all. It's funny watching it, and it's really cool that everybody can, jump on. What is this game? Jump on YouTube and
Yeah.
see how it goes. And that goes for, I guess, card and video games and any of it. But back in the 70s and 80s, there wasn't, and there was no. I don't even think the retailer playing at retail shops doesn't come around till much later in the
Yeah.
hobby. So it's really you get these books and you try, you try to figure out what's going on and how it plays, and then you just go. And it's funny too because we talk about that a lot in the design process of Castles and Crusades. In these early games, there wasn't clear instructions on how to play. It
Hmm.
wasn't all kind of laid out. There wasn't any kind of sample modules. Like we've got one that we've written that kind of walks you through how the siege engine works, the attribute check system. But there was nothing like that
Oh no.
in those days. It was just figure it out.
Yeah, it's so there's kind of two paths there. There's, in one case, like I think the first edition DMG tried to do that and it did it really well. And then very quickly the Dungeon Master's guides went away from here's how to be a DM to kind of here's the tools that you need.
Yeah.
And I think the Castle Keeper's guide does a great job of like threading those two paths. Um,
It's probably one of the things, and we've got three of us are working on this now. One of the things we've never really done, And I get you're right. I have forgotten this. The DMG actually had a module in the back of it, in the
Mm-hmm.
back of it, a how to. I never looked at that because by the time I got to DMG, I knew how to
What you were
play.
doing, yeah.
You're right. So I never really looked at it, but that slipped my mind. But it's one of the things that we don't have yet. We are working on it to get kind of an intro set, a how-to set, so people can jump into it. It's an easy game. It's a
It really
crazy,
is.
yeah. It's very very easy. But I found in running it so many years at conventions, it's not, especially for younger gamers, it's not as, I don't know if intuitive is the word I'm looking for, but there's a little bit of a learning curve
Mm-hmm.
in that you have to kind of unteach yourself to look for the skill or the feat or whatever it is that guides you in whatever game you're playing, because really your imagination is running the show with Castles Crusades. You kind of got to say, I try this, I try that, you roll a dice and see if you succeed.
Right. You're not limited by the options presented on your character sheet. You're limited by what you can imagine in the situation.
Yeah, that actually was one of our early taglines, was you're limited only by your imagination.
Well,
And
this.
that,
Oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say this is a great time. First of all, let me say hello to Tinker Hellraiser. Thank you for all of the work on getting social media stuff put together. To John Doom, it's good to see you. To you as well, Dream Shaper, and welcome to. I'm going to totally butcher that. To our new friend on the chat. If you guys have any questions for Steve, please let me know. I will ask them as we go through this. But this feels like a good time. Do you want to take a quick um, do a quick overview of what the siege engine is and how it works?
Sure. So I'll do a quick one, and we can go into it more depth later. So basically, in Castles and Crusades, you've got two basic mechanics: the combat mechanic, which is almost identical to most of D&D versions, except
Mm-hmm.
we have a ascending armor class as opposed to AD&D's descending armor class. But the attribute checks is the second mechanic. So anytime you attempt to do anything, swim a river, climb a wall, convince a barkeep to give you some room, or whatever it is, you're going to make an attribute check. And the attributes are there's the six standard attributes that you see in Dungeons and Dragons. It's very familiar. The real difference is you have primary attributes and secondary attributes. And your primary attributes, your base chance to succeed at any task is 12. And on a secondary attribute, your base chance to succeed is 18. You're going to add, when you roll your d20, you're going to add your level to that, and you're going to add your attribute bonus to it, and anything else, spells or magic items or whatever else you may have on there. And on the flip side of the screens, the CK, which is our GM, is going to add a challenge level to that challenge base. And then if you're combined to roll your d20 plus all your bonuses equals or exceeds his challenge level plus the 12 or 18, you succeed or fail based on that. And it's that easy. And it sounds far more complicated in the explanation than it actually is. It's a very, very simple attribute check system that allows you allows the CK to resolve anything very, very quickly, and it allows the players to try anything. And there's some kind of mechanic that gives them an actual chance to succeed at that.
And you tie it back to the six attributes as opposed to imposing a skill system on which tends to, like, in my opinion, you go back and you look at first and second edition D&D, and so much of it was just either attribute check. There were attribute checks. Even proficiencies ended up just being attribute checks, and the skill system kind of divorces the attention from the class abilities and the attributes.
Yeah, in the early days, it's funny because we really didn't, before the proficiencies came out. I think there's some in the DMG, but I honestly can't remember at this point. It was really in the early days. It's just, I want to swim the river. There's no real mechanic to swim the river, so you just kind of, it becomes a dex check, or it becomes a whatever, and you wield it. And I think later in the Wilderness and Dungeoneer Survivor,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe some of the box sets. Now, I never ran the box sets, so I can't. Those may have had some kind of check system in there, buried in their stuff. But I was an AD&D guy. But CNC really, what we tried to do, having run games so very very long, I know that players get easily constrained by a list of abilities. These are the 8 things that I can do. Well, what if I want to do this, or I want to do that? And we had been evolving that at our table forever and a day. And when Mac and Davis developed the Siege Engine, it became this absolute perfect way for players to try whatever it is. And really, the one of the things that I like to stress, though, in the Player's Handbook, we've got a list of saving throws attached to attributes. That's really just a guide.
Hmm.
The CK can do if you're a wizard and you want to swim the river, I might have you make an intelligence check or a constitution check or a strength check. It doesn't have to be a dex check, and the CK doesn't have to justify it. It's really, this is what you're doing, and so that gives the CK storytelling power, and that gives the player actual power to kind of break those constraints that you were talking about that are put on you by this skill system or whatever it is.
Yeah. So Lee said that they played Castles and Crusades for the first time this year at GaryCon. None of them had played before, and he's pretty sure they all loved it. So, welcome, Lee.
Nice,
And
very cool.
yeah,
Yes, absolutely.
I like, as a GM, I like the fact that I can set the DC for a check and really just say, hey guys, this is going to be a +2 or +4 or whatever I set it at, and then it all becomes player facing. All right, well, what can I justify for this? Is it my primary attribute, in which case it's 12 plus whatever the GM just said or CK just said, or is it a secondary attribute, in which case it's 18 plus whatever the CK just said.
And it becomes
runs
that easy. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, it becomes it's that easy, and it sounds like when you're reading it, you're like, oh, this is a bunch of stuff, but it really isn't. It's just two numbers. It literally is just two numbers, and you can do things with those numbers. Like Davis, my brother, he'll always take his. If you're a human, you have 3 primary attributes, and if you're a demi-human, you have 2. Now, one of those is chosen. So if you're a fighter, you have strength. You have to have strength as a prime. Blah blah blah. So if you're playing like a human, you've got 2 primes that you can pick anywhere, and he's always putting them on non-class abilities to give his character strengths that he doesn't normally have listed in the book. It's very interesting. So it gives there's so much latitude for character creation and just unlocking your imagination that it's crazy.
I'm always the guy who wants to play a really smart fighter to represent like my ability for strategy and tactics. And there are ways to build a character to do that, but I like the fact that in this case, it's just a matter of like, I can justify it as one of my primary attributes and then rely upon it as I run through the game.
Yeah, it actually plays out at the table as opposed to you having to role play it or whatever. You've actually got the mechanic. And that gives, and it's really hard to overstate that it gives the CK a tool to react to all of these things. You want a super smart fighter or whatever. Now you've got a tool that actually allows you to very quickly on the fly, react to whatever players say, and players are always doing crazy stuff. So, it gives you that mechanic, which is invaluable. At least at my table, it's invaluable.
Oh yeah. So how did Castles and Crusades come about? I've watched a lot of interviews with you, and I know we've talked about you've talked about this before, but for people on the Iconic Production channel who have never heard about this, how did Castles and Crusades sort of emerge? Because it came about during the early OGL era.
Yeah, so I'm going to give you my version. There's 3 of us involved with it. And it's really funny. We did this. I'm not sure the guys are doing it anymore, but there was a Crusader podcast for several years. And
I listened to it.
Okay, yeah. So they interviewed me, and then Mac and Davis and Tyler asked each one of us that question. And they're all a little bit different, which I think is absolutely beautiful.
Yeah,
it's the way oral history plays out.
Exactly.
But so Mac and I had been going to Dragon Con for years. Oh, wait, now that's the creation of Troller Games. But we're on Castles Crusades. So Castles and Crusades, we founded the company in '99, and we start publishing in 2000. And we have our own game called Swords and Sorcery. I think it might be Sword and Sorcery. I can't remember if there's a plural on there. That game was put in the back of our adventure modules, and we did 3 adventure modules at the time. Now, as soon as D20 exploded, we shifted everything into D20. We adopted the OGL, put that in our books, and we started publishing stuff that was compatible with Dungeons and Dragons. And we did that up through about, I think it was 2003, when a good friend of mine, John Nephew from Atlas Games, we were at the Gamma Trade Show at a bar somewhere, I think, or something. He came over and he said, "Hey man, what's your action plan for when the bubble pops?" And of course, in 2002 and 2003, the D20 sales were astronomical. They were through the roof. They were supporting a huge community. And I didn't know what he was talking about. I come from a history background, so I'm like, what are you talking about? And he explained how the whole thing is fixing to come crashing down because there's too many publishers, too much content. It'll hit its whatever nadir, and then it'll collapse. So we began talking about what to do for this, and we were exploring all kinds of stuff. And Davis and Mac had long Davis had long since wanted to leave D20 and do his own type of stuff, and Mac loves to design games. And I was never a giant fan of third edition just because it was kind of
Oh
complicated
yeah.
for my gaming style. It just didn't work that well. It's a great game, but it's just not one made for me. So these kind of currents were floating around Troller Games, and of course we're publishing Gary Gygax at the time, and he had his Castles Crusades material that he wanted to finally start putting out, starting with Yigsburg and some other stuff. And we got to talking about it, and he said, "Yeah, there you go." Yigsburg. We got to talking about it, and he had kind of shopped it around a little bit, and then he and I sat down and talked about it. And he said that I said best way to do it is to kind of make your own game system, put them in the back, and put the OGL in there, and you're golden. You can make, because he wanted it very much like AD&D. I said that's the easiest way, but he didn't want anything to do with that. He was creating his Legendary Adventures
Mm-hmm.
game. He didn't want to do a new D&D spinoff or whatever. So he, asked what we were doing, and then that kind of led me to get Davis and Mac on the phone and say, "Hey, man, Gary Gygax, if we create a game for him, he'll put Castles Crusades out in with Castles and Crusades."
And you
So
don't say no to something like that.
yeah, right, yeah, a little bit. So that kind of fit with, and since I was the face of the company and the main salesman at the conventions and everything, and everyone could tell I wasn't enthusiastic selling D20 stuff. I mean, it was cool, but it wasn't my, I can't get in there and explain, playing a
Mm-hmm.
24-person game or whatever I'm doing. And so we sat down and we had this long conversation. And I remember Davis or Mac one asked me what type of game, if we design this game for both ourselves and Gary Gygax, what type of game does it have to be? And I said, well, it has to be something like the spirit of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons.
Mm-hmm.
And that spirit being, there were so few rules in the beginning that we had to make it up ourselves. We had to go
Mm-hmm.
our own way. And so that when TSR started putting out more rules, we were very happy to just say, no, I'm not using. I've already got my own rules. I did this 4 years ago, whatever. So those two, Davis and Max, sat down and began designing the Siege Engine. They did that on Davis's porch and Max's porch. They lived across the street from each other. They would get their children to bed, and one would go to the other's porch and sit there and drink coffee and smoke cigarettes until they had kind of hacked this out. And it took about, I guess, 8 months, 9 months. There's a lot of playtesting online that we did. We had a whole bunch of groups that got involved and began playtesting it. And about 8 or 9 months, they had a pretty good working system. And each time we would create a rule, we would feed it to Gary to make sure that it would work for what he was writing for Castle Zagging, and then back around. And the only caveat I had on the rule, because I hate reading rules, is the rule has to be so simple. I have to read it and understand it in the first pass. And if I don't, it goes back to Davis and Mac. And there's quite a few rules. I don't know what you're saying. Just rewrite it. Make it easy. So those three things, kind of my desire to have something that I was more passionate about, Gary's Castle Zagging and Davis and Mac's desire to actually create a game, came together in this beautiful, moment in 2003, it'd be 2004, really. And I believe we it had to been 2003, late 03 and into 04, because we launched 110 copies of the white box, the original white box set at Gen Con 2004. Game wasn't completely done. The Siege Engine was done, but we'd only done a few of the classes, and those really hadn't been fleshed out. And we had like 30 monsters or something, I think. And then the Player's Handbook came out in December, I believe, of 04. So it's about a year or so, give or take, in design, writing, and all that stuff to get the thing together. But that's the reason Castles Crusades came about.
Oh,
Gary, me, and Davis and Mac.
Well, I just have a list of questions, and while I would love to go into the history nerd side of things, because that's my passion as well. Currently reading like a book on Babylonian exorcism rites, as well as a book on the Templars. Let's talk about Gary, because Gary Gygax, for John Doom, who I know doesn't know this, just teasing John. Gary co-created this hobby that has come to dominate my life and the lives of so many others, has been so influential broadly culturally. You have writers and television and movie people who are all saying, yeah, the reason I got into all of this is because of my
Yeah.
experience with Dungeons and Dragons. You guys at Troll Lord Games got to work with Gary on several projects, one of which now is on Kickstarter. The Hermit is
Yes.
on Kickstarter. I'll pull that up. How did you get involved with Gary? I mean, you just republished Castle Zagig, and there's hopefully more coming down the line. So,
Hopefully more. I talked to the attorney today for the estate, so hopefully we'll have some movement on some stuff. I'll have some news on some stuff soon. Yeah. So and I will say to Gary's impact on a hobby, when he crossed over, I was pretty devastated, but I started getting these phone calls almost immediately, NPR, all these places. But the oddest phone call I got that day was from one of the VPs over at Sony Entertainment, who was heading up the video game department or whatever. And he was in tears or almost in tears. And he said, man, Gary, if without Gary Gygax, this entire hobby, and he was talking about the video game hobby, the entire hobby wouldn't exist. And I think you can't, it's really been hitting me lately. You can't really overstate his importance. I know that there was other people involved. There were a lot of people involved. Dave Arneson, Jim Ward, Frank Minster. There's a whole bunch of folks that were part of that, Darlene. But at the end of the day, there was only one person that had the mental fortitude to push this thing into the stratosphere.
yeah.
And that was Gary. I mean, I think it takes a certain amount of ambition or whatever you want to call it to actually kind of make that leap. And he certainly made that leap and made the right choices and was at the right spot at the right time or whatever it is. So I think you just can't, you cannot overstate his importance to what we're all doing now. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So when we first debuted, to answer your question, we first debuted in the year 2000 at Gen Con. Now, we published 3 adventures, a world setting, and a map. And the adventures were not technically D&D. They were actually that sword and sorcery game that I was talking about.
One of those was The Rising Knight, correct?
No, that it was Vakuun's Mortality of Green, the Fantastic Adventure, and then the After Winter Dark fantasy campaign setting, which later became Aihrde.
Right.
The Rising Knight, interestingly enough, we can talk about that later, but yes, the Codex of Aihrde.
Yeah.
The Rising Knight actually came after A1. It was
It was a prequel.
It was a prequel. Yeah, we'd already published A1, and Davis went back and did A0. But so anyway, so we're at the convention. It's crazy. It's just it's Gen Con. It's our first Gen Con. We don't know what's going on. It's just nuts. Mac had a much more. He was much more calculated plan when he was there than Davis and I did. I certainly was just going. I really was going there because we've been going to Dragon Con for years, and I didn't think our little company would survive. So I was just using it as a way to pay for a trip to Gen Con. So that was really my motivation. But so Mac takes these adventures that we've written and the world setting and the map, and he just went by Gary's booth at Hecka Forge and just, got him to sign a few things and gave him, he said, look, we're publishing too. Just wanted to give you this as a thank you because, you've meant so much to me. And Mac is I was a big Gary Gygax fan, but Mac was just a huge Gary Gygax fan. So he leaves the books. And then a couple of weeks later, when at that Gen Con, we got picked up by ACD Distribution, and then we got picked up by a consolidator. And suddenly we find ourselves selling not hundreds, but several thousand adventure modules. And we weren't prepared for that at all. So we needed content. And Mac and I are talking about what we're going to do. Davis has a full-time job. Mac has a full-time job. That means I've got to do the writing right now. And I got cracking on, I think, Line on the Ropes. No, Malady of Kings was the next one.
Okay.
I began writing, but we needed stuff fast. So Max suggested, hey, why don't you contact Gary, send him an email, see if he got a chance to look at our books and just say, hey, do a follow-up as a thank you. Now, looking back, this was all carefully planned, I suspect, by Mac. I suspect he probably had
puppet
this
mastering
kind of
in the background.
Yeah. he really does think ahead. I don't. He does. So I shot Gary an email, and to my surprise, Gary responded within hours. Shot me an email back. Something I learned about him was he was extraordinarily attentive to fans, to people who reached out to him. He responded all the time. So he responds and said, "Hey, I've read it. I read some of them. I don't know if you read them all or whatever, but these are very cool, very interesting. I really enjoyed them." And then I sent him a thank you back and said, hey, and this was again at Mac's suggestion, hey, man, if you're interested, we would love to publish some Gary Gygax stuff. And within, I don't know, the next 2 days, we were on the phone with him talking about a wide variety of products. And he was using Hecaforge he was partner in a company called Hecaforge. And Chris Clark, a good friend of mine, they had done a bunch of LA stuff, but they were doing kind of low key things. And Gary had these huge projects that he wanted to work on, mostly the Gygaxian Fantasy World series, which was
Hmm.
this giant hardcover set that he envisioned, I don't know, however he wanted it, but this huge just encyclopedia of how to world build, role play,
I
all of
have the name book, and it is so well loved that I'm about to rebind it, I think, for the second time.
it. Well, luckily we got the license to do those again, so
Yes.
those will be coming out again. Yeah, those books I use them. They're in my desk now, and they're
Hmm.
at my gaming table. I use them
Yeah.
continually. So he pitches these, and he pitches the Lost City of Caxmore. We were looking for adventure content. He didn't have much that he wanted and that he was interested in doing. He really was done with adventures. So he signed. When we signed the contract, he was going to write the original contract. He had to write a very short adventure for the Codex of Aihrde that I was working on, and we were going to publish the Lost City of Caxmore by his two sons, which was an adventure, and then the Gygaxian Fantasy World series, and it was an open-ended series. So it was this surreal, I go to Gen Con with no idea of what I'm doing or game mechanics or selling, anything. Like, I'm working on my PhD in history, for God's sake. I don't have any idea what's going on. But I'm having a good time, and it works out. And then 3 weeks later, I'm publishing Gary Gygax. It was very surreal.
Oh,
It was just weird. He turned it, we worked together. We were his primary publisher. He left Hecaforge shortly thereafter, and we were really his only publisher until he died.
yeah.
We worked on, I don't know, 50 or so projects together and had a whole ton of them in the pipeline when the licenses were pulled and he passed away. But yeah, it was a wild ride.
That's, man.
Yeah.
Uh, well, again, just hundreds of questions, more than I can possibly ask in our time for today. But what's your favorite memory of working with Gary?
I think there's a couple. There's probably three that really stand. There's so many that stand out, but I remember he really enjoyed one of the things that he and I got along very, very well with is he didn't really like talking about the minutia of business and all of that. He would, but he didn't particularly like it. He really liked to talk about history and food and movies.
I love all
Movies a little,
three. Yeah.
yeah. And I'm a huge history buff. I was working on my PhD at
Yeah.
the time, so he and I frequently, I would, Gail, his wife, was kind of the business end of that thing. So I would talk business with Gail and then go just sit with Gary and we chat, whatever. The last real conversation we had, we argued over who's the director, Peter Jackson's King Kong. He did not like Peter
Oh.
Jackson's King Kong. I liked Peter Jackson's King Kong. So we argued over that. But I think my fondest memory, we were sitting at a table. We did once Gen Con left, where was it? Milwaukee. Once it left
Hmm.
Milwaukee and went to Indianapolis, he didn't have a convention to easily get to. There was one called Game Fest that was in Milwaukee for like 2 years, and then
Hmm.
it kind of, I think it moved on. And after that, we started running conventions in Lake Geneva so he could have somewhere to meet his fans, and his fans had somewhere to go. We did one in the winter and one in the summer. So we'd go up there 2 times a year at least and hang out, do the con, and hang out on his front porch. A couple of days before the con and that Sunday after the con, and usually every night we'd go out to dinner with Gary and hang out. But we would always gather on that porch and just sit and chat until it was dinner time or whatever. And he always had puns. He loved puns. He was constant, and I don't get them. My brain doesn't work that way. So he was always doing these puns, and he would tell them, and everyone would be chuckling, but he would always look right at me because he knew I didn't get it. And I think he took a little bit of pleasure out of watching me squirm
Sure.
with his puns, which was awesome. He was just, I don't know, he was just a joy to sit and chat with. He loved drinking this Serbian whiskey called, I cannot pronounce it, Srebovich or something like this. So
Really?
I'd pick him up this bottle of Serbian whiskey, and I come from Evan Williams, which is pretty stout, but
Yeah.
that whatever it was insanely stout, and we'd sit there and drink that. I remember one day I had like 2 shots, and it was really more than I was willing to commit to. and he was talking, but he was waiting for me to drink that shot. I mean, he knew he knew I didn't want it, but he wasn't going to let me off the hook. And I remember someone got his attention, and I gave it to Davis, and Davis downed it real quick and gave it back to me. He looked back, and I think he suspected some shenanigans had gone on, but it was pretty cool. He was just a great guy. I just thoroughly enjoyed working with Gary.
Oh, that's awesome. So speaking of working with Gary, I posted the link in the chat. You've got the Hermit Kickstarter going on right now.
Yes.
For people who haven't heard about it or haven't poured through it, I'm a backer, so I'm really excited about that. What is the Hermit, and what's kind of the story behind it?
So the Hermit was one of those we kept pestering Gary about, and once the publications began, we did the Canting Crew first. He wrote the little piece for the Codex of Aihrde, and then he did the Canting Crew. We did the Lost City of Gaxmore, and then of his we did the Canting Crew and the World Builder. But what was really selling like crazy in the D20 days is adventures. They were just selling like nuts. Source books were okay, but I think the immediate spin-off into all of the, what were those little classes called? Prestige classes. The immediate spin-off into prestige classes had created just so many source books that people were quickly getting inundated with them. But they were still looking for adventures. So I just kept pestering him about adventures, and he hated them. He hated writing adventures. He just didn't want to do it. But he had written one for Legendary Adventures called The Hermit, which he said, fine, why don't you take this one, see what you can do with it, convert it, do what you want to do. So we took The Hermit, and I can't remember who converted it, but we converted it to Dungeons and Dragons from its original LA version. And I remember reading it. I never ran it as third edition, but I did kind of run it as a hybrid AD&D adventure. But I remember reading it, and I don't want to give much away because
Right.
there's some crazy surprises in it, and not surprises like you're thinking. It's not like, it's just bizarre. It's like reading 1970s fantasy. You're reading it going, what the, what, that's because you could tell that Gary's mind wasn't, there was no path that he's got to follow, right? He's just letting it go in whichever, there's no tropes that he's using. He's just letting it go wherever. So The Hermit, when I'm reading it, I was stunned at some of the scenes that take place. And even now, since we're republishing it, I'm having to explain to the artists how to do these scenes because they're really weird. I mean, they're very odd, the way your characters should see it. But I'd love some great representations of this. What happens to your characters from shrinking? It's not really extra dimensional. It's just some strange, weird stuff. It's a high level adventure. And basically, The Hermit, the premise is the king is calling all of his sages to gather and give him advice. One of his sages, his most intelligent sage, has gone missing, and that's the Hermit. And the king hires you to go find him. And I won't give too much away about all of that, but that in it is the mission. And then you got to wind your way through Gary Gygax's imagination before you can get to the end of this thing. So
I'm looking forward to it.
I absolutely love it. So when I read it, I thought this is probably the coolest adventure I've ever read. You know, just from my perspective. Others may disagree, but when I read it, I thought, okay, this is just wild. Because I love it when you're running a game, and I'm sure you're the same way, and you catch your players completely off guard. They don't know what's going on.
Yes.
It's great. It's I mean, it's wonderful.
Well, and vice versa, right? Like I also love when the players have the creativity to. I think I was telling you a little bit before the stream about the A series, second edition D&D game that I'm running, and I told you about the twist that I had that caught my players off guard. But
Right.
the previous year it ended because they had gone through A1, Assault on Blacktooth Ridge, and they had gone to the treasure vault to stop the you're gonna have to forgive me, my brain's just not working tonight. The creature that was raised raised from the dead in A0, I think. And,
yeah, I can't remember the name.
Yeah. So they had bartered with some fairies for a magic item that was they had determined it was a force wall, but they didn't know how long it was going to last, and the fairies could only tell them 17. So they're attacked by the hobgoblins, and the druid was just like, screw it. Then he throws down this little force wall, and it pops up and it separates the dungeon in half. And they're like, well, how long does it last? And then they make some checks, and they realize the only thing that fairies really care about is the cycle of the moon. And so they figured out that they had sealed off the other half of the dungeon for 17 months. And so they came back around this next year to deal with that. So I love when adventures support just stuff that we haven't seen before, because again, fantasy, it's very easy to feel like, okay, I've seen that, I've
Right.
done that. Um, but Gary, you go back and you look at Appendix N, and Gary was steeped in so much of the 70s, like, fantasy stuff, and he kind of absorbed it all and was able to create these amalgamations out of it that, if you haven't been reading those, you may not even see where the original sources come from, and it still all feels fresh to you.
Yeah, that's the thing about it, and I got to second your comments that I love it when players throw me a curveball. It's really nice because you get into these things, and it's easy when you're running a game to get kind of stuck in whatever mode that you're in, waiting
Mm-hmm.
for them to figure something out. But when they make you stop and you have to think, it's great, and that's really a lot of what Gary's stuff does, especially the Hermit. It will certainly make you kind of regear yourself when you're when you're tramping through it. And it's funny too, because that when you mentioned that 70s literature, I remember I went through a spate of reading fantasy fiction from the 1920s, and not weird tale stuff, not the Robert E. Howard,
Right.
Lovecrafty stuff, but just these weird fantasy novels. The Worm Oribus comes to mind.
Oh,
Just
I
these weird,
love the Worm Oribus.
and they're just weird because there's no, and I use weird in the best kind of sense, because there's no, Tolkien kind of sets the stage for us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or this, goblins, or this, dragons, or this. But before that, there's nothing. There's no stereotypes. There's no nothing. These guys are just creating wild,
Yeah.
and I think that carries on through deep into the 70s and a little bit into the 80s, where you're reading this fantasy fiction. There's no template for it,
Yeah.
right? By the 90s, there's kind of a template. It's when I kind of dropped off on the fantasy. I read it a little bit, but there was just everything seemed to be doing a little bit of the same. And I'd read
Mm-hmm.
this before, but if you take just a little time, I think, and dive into some of that 70s stuff, and it's only like 120 pages.
Yeah, they're
They're all
short.
short as hell. And if you're bored with it, you just got to spend 4 or 5 hours to and go to another one because you're done. It's not that much reading, but it really is stuff that'll make you kind of retool the way you
Oh
look at
man,
stuff.
Lord Dunsany comes to mind as just weird. But I also just recently read. I've always read. Um, I was exposed to Three Hearts, Three Lions by Paul Anderson very early on, but I just recently read The Broken Sword. I don't know if you've read that one.
That sounds very familiar. Is that um,
It's Paul Anderson, but it's
oh
this.
no, no. I'm thinking Misenchanted Sword by
Oh,
Lawrence Evans. Yeah.
yeah. Broken Sword is this beautiful. I mean, it's inspired by German fairy tales and Celtic fairy tales and Norse mythology, and it's short. I think it's actually free to listen to on Audible, and it's like 8 hours long. And like you said, it's just 120 pages. You're in, you're out, you're done, and he
Yep.
covers just the gamut.
I can't remember. I'm sure I've read Paul Anderson at some point. I went through a spate in the 80s. I would take, I can't remember what percentage it was, but 10 or 15% of my paycheck and go to Walden Books and just buy,
Mm-hmm.
whatever I could and just read it. So I read just all kinds of just people, just one shots. There's this author never published ever again. But it was cool because it's different. Everything's a
Yeah.
little bit different. And that really, I think, the core of role playing games, that's really what it is. It's different stuff. You play under any different DM or GM and with different players, and that game's going to be different. It's not what you played last Sunday, because
Yeah.
there's a different set of minds going on.
Uh, there's a book coming out that I contributed an article to about recovering imagination, and I did an article about role playing games, kind of as, for lack of a better term, like a liturgical kind of experience, because we all gather together at the same time. There's food involved. We're gathering around with friends, and it produces something beautiful. And it's beautiful because it's unique. Like you can take the same adventure module and the same group of players and change the GM, and you're gonna have a completely different story at the end of it. You change one player out of that group, and you have a completely different
Yep.
memory that only exists for the people at the table. That's kind of, I always say, when people are like, what's role playing games like? I'm like, well, if you played a board game, you might remember that time that you rolled three sixes invading Kamchatka, out of Alaska in Risk. But unless you're the guy from Red Dwarf, you're not writing down all of your
Right.
Risk game. Yeah, remember your Risk game memories. But like we play a game of Castles and Crusades, and you have this memory that Bob saved your life. He saved your
Yep.
life from that dragon, and that memory only exists for those people there, and it would not be the same memory if even one of those people was changed.
No, and it lasts forever. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I've been playing since '75, and I can remember stuff back in the '70s, characters that died or
Yeah.
characters that didn't. It's a very interesting. I don't know. It's. I think it is. I have this on my Twitter bio or something. It is the most unique game there is, bar none.
Yes.
Uh, every other hobby game has its strengths and its weaknesses or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, but nothing is like tabletop role playing
Yeah.
games. And it's really, at the end of the day, I've played a few card games, I've played a few board games, but 90% of my gaming, probably 95% of my gaming is role playing at the
Yeah.
table.
I'm the same way.
I,
I We'll sit down to play something. Some friends came out for Thanksgiving and they brought Mansions of Madness, and I loved it. But the whole time I was thinking, well, why aren't we just playing Call of Cthulhu this whole weekend? Like,
right.
I
We have
I
time, we're all here.
I could be running Call of Cthulhu for you right now.
Yeah.
All right, so let's take a step back and talk about Castle Zygag, or Zagig.
I'm gonna get a Dr. Pepper real quick. It's right in here.
Okay, go for it. I have heard tales of your Dr. Pepper love.
I do have a bit of a, yeah, we'll go with love.
You can stop whenever you want. It's love.
Yes, yes. It's not an addiction at all.
It's not an addiction at all. So, man, Yigsburg is fantastic, and this is kind of the opening. This was kind of the reopening, if you will, of the Gygaxian vaults, being able to republish Yigsburg. The map with Darlene map is. I have a deep and abiding love for Greyhawk, so just seeing that art style on the map,
Yeah.
the fact that Gary's directly speaking to you, like, "Hey, this next section is long, and you may think it's boring, but it's super important for GMs to understand that this is how you create a culture and a setting." I loved all of that information. Can you talk a little bit about Yigsburg, and then are we hopeful that there's going to be more of this castle series coming out?
So Yigsburg, when Gary came to us and with the idea of approaching Castle Zagging, everyone knows. Of course, it was Castle Greyhawk back in the TSR days, and everyone knows it as that's his iteration of Castle Greyhawk, so Castle Zagging, and we all think of the dungeons.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when he pitched it to us, it's this whole kind of setting. And I remember
Mm-hmm.
being a little bit frustrated with him because, we're going to do Castles and Crusades. You're going to do Castle Saggy. We're going to roll this mega dungeon out, blah, blah, blah. We're golden. And so he says, all right, to get the mega dungeon out, we've got to do Yigsburg first. I'm like, what is Yigsburg now? So he explains to me that Yigsburg is the town that's downriver from Greyhawk and it's near Castle Greyhawk. So he creates, and I'm sorry, that's fine, whatever. It's your setting. I'm certainly not going to, whatever. That we had a very good relationship in that he kind of told me what he wanted to publish, and if we wanted to publish it, that's what we did. So, I didn't have a whole lot of say in the way he was going to present Castle Zagging. I certainly wasn't thinking about his mortality at the time. But so he launches into this massive project of Castle Zagging Yigsburg. And his idea was to do the city first, then the setting, the East Mark, and then the castle itself, the mansions of Zagging, and then beneath it are the dungeons. That was the whole approach. And we had, I can't remember, I want to say it's 8 boxes or 9 box sets that we were planning, at least 17 levels of dungeons, 4 levels of the castle, and then the city, and then the setting itself. So he does Yigsburg in this absolutely beautiful book. It's massive. It's far greater than I ever thought it would be. It's highly detailed. We got a cover. I secured covers for all 8 of these books, or 9 of them, or whatever it was, from Jeffrey Jones. Jeffrey Catherine Jones. Later, she transitioned. Which, when you look at the school of art from the 70s, everyone talks about Frazetta.
Mm-hmm.
I was a huge Jeffrey Jones fan. Jones's art, you should just go check it out online. You've seen it. If you've read 70s and 80s fiction, you
Mm-hmm.
have seen Jones's work. It's just absolutely amazing. So we secured all of these paintings for the covers of the Zagging book. And the first one is on the Yigsburg that you're holding in your hand.
Yeah.
Uh,
You saw me looking at it. Yeah, it's
yeah, I think
beautiful.
that's called The Rose. And then Gary had just reestablished relationships, reached out, made contact with Darlene, who had long been out of the business for years and years and years, and wanted her to do the map for Yigsburg and the East Mark. And I thought, well, this is too cool, because like you, I'm a huge Greyhawk
Yeah.
fan, absolutely monstrous Greyhawk fan. But so the team kind of came together. Gary and Darlene putting this stuff together. She drew the maps. She did some of the art. I think Peter Bradley. Peter Bradley did the rest of the art. Peter and maybe Jason and Walton. So he delivers this massive tome to us, much bigger than we thought it was going to be. But it rolls down and it's beautiful. And he immediately got sidetracked from doing. Next we do the folio. Next we did the setting, but he immediately got sidetracked because he wanted to detail the Yigsburg even more. He was super happy with the book. He got all that stuff out. But look, there's 14 neighborhoods in Yigsburg. Why don't we do a book on each neighborhood? I'm like, all right, that's great, but
The goal is
yeah,
Castle is the Dungeons of Greyhawk. Like, we've been waiting
at some point
for 40
so
years.
he was having none of that. So he started working on the neighborhoods, and he hired this really good crew of folks, of which Jeffrey Talanian from Northwind Publications
Oh man,
yeah, absolutely.
love Hyperborea.
Yes, absolutely. Got it on the shelf right there. So Jeff actually is so good and works so well with Gary that Gary starts giving him more neighborhoods. And then eventually Gary hires him to work on the dungeons themselves. So there's about 8 neighborhoods in the works when Gary finally starts working on the dungeons themselves. And we got through the castle. The castle was done. So I think he's got 4 books to the castle. And he did the 2 of them did the first level of 17 levels of the dungeon, and he passed away in the production process of that. We didn't have the box made. We didn't have art gathered. We only had the 1 cover. It was nowhere near completion when he passed away. It was written. It was in the editing process. We had so much more work to do. And then Gail pulled the licenses in August. So I asked her, I said, look, this is fine. I didn't want to get into a legal battle with her.
Yeah.
I really didn't. My big thing was I didn't want Gary's relationship, the memory of people's memory of Gary's relationship with Troll Lord Games to be a big lawsuit. I just didn't want that. So I let her out of the contracts, but I had a caveat that let us get Castle Zagging out first. So we scrambled like lunatics to get that, and that's why it looks. I'm not real happy with its presentation because we had to hobble that thing together so fast to get it to the printers and get it out before the end of the year, which is when she wanted everything destroyed. We had to sell it. Everything that we hadn't sold by the end of the year had to be destroyed. So it was a madcap run from August to October, whenever that thing came out, to get it out. I'm super proud of the project. I just think the art could have been a little bit better. The box could have looked a little nicer, whatever. But and that kind of killed it. So there it sits for many, many years. Once we lost the licenses, the material just sat forever. Gail tried to do some stuff with it. Nothing ever came of it. And I guess a few months ago, 2 or 3 months ago, when Luke called me and said, hey, we need you as a witness in this case. Do you mind? I said, no, absolutely. I'll jump into whatever you need me to do. And then Luke and I started talking. And then the estate, Luke had a hand in it. I can't say too much about that end of stuff, but the estate, I reached out to the estate. I gave them a battle plan. This is what we'd like to do. And I didn't ask for a lot because I didn't know how the judge was going to respond. I just didn't, you never know about these.
No.
So I picked one heavy hitter, the Gygaxian Fantasy World Series, and then one reprint because I know that the estate was pretty deep in debt and they needed some money fast to pay to the feds or the Wisconsin or whoever the hell they
Yeah.
owed it to. That I'm not privy to. It was just a substantial sum of money. So I said the best thing that I can do to get you money fast is reprint something. Davis came up with the idea of pulling Yigsburg out and just reprinting it as is. We did it the classic version,
Yeah.
which is what you got in your hand, and it sold. It's continuing to sell. It did absolutely fantastic, and we were able to cut two very big checks to the estates, which was
Awesome.
great. And then the Kickstarter we did, and the other one, the third piece I chose was the Hermit, which was my favorite, and I just wanted it back out there and treat it really well. When we originally did the Hermit, it's a 56 page, and it's got Dungeons and Dragons and Legendary Adventures. But really, Gary was writing for Castles and Crusades at the end, so it just seems to fit that it
Yeah.
should be a D&D esque as humanly possible, and I think that's CNC. So now we can give it a really nice treatment, and that was the Hermit. And then the heavy hitter, of course, the Gygaxian Fantasy World Series. We'll be doing first quarter next year, and that'll be all 7 volumes of that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's going to be a fantastic, huge, and get that stuff back out there
It's
because
gonna
it
break my
really,
wallet.
yeah, yeah. Well, the thing that frustrates me a little bit, I guess about I guess during COVID is when fifth edition explodes,
Mm-hmm.
and right after that, everyone's world building. It's on every social media platform.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
everybody world building, and these 7 books of Gary's are literally what everyone needed. They they needed these 7 books because they tell you how to do it all. So it was a little frustrating seeing that stuff wasn't actually out there. So I'm super excited to see that hit the trail again. Now, as for more Castle Zagig, I have made a second petition to the court. I did about 2 months ago, 6 weeks ago, something like that. I got an email back from the attorney today, so no confirmation, but with some contractual stuff with TLG and the estate. So I am encouraged that something may actually come of this.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it would be amazing to finally get. I've got a mountain of his notes here on the computer. I've talked to Jeff Talanian about consulting with it. If that, I don't know if he'll do it or not. I hope he does. But I think I don't know. I think it would be good for Gary, and it would be good for the community to see this thing finally treated how he wanted it treated.
Yeah. And I mean, there are several versions of Castle Greyhawk. Some of them, not to disparage someone else's work, but some of them treated less respectfully than I think anyone in the actual market wanted them to be done.
Right.
I did not expect a funhouse dungeon version of.
I had purged that from my mind. And again, I don't want to disparage whoever wrote that, but I had purged it from my mind years ago. And someone brought it up a few months ago. I was like, oh, yeah, there was that version of it.
It's like when someone's like, what if they made a Hobbit movie as a trilogy? I'm like, well, that would never happen. What are you talking about?
Man, I tried to like those. I tried to like the Hobbit trilogy. I tried really hard.
Well, all right. So you have a deep and abiding love of Greyhawk, which I do as well. I think there's just something special to Greyhawk. I remember reading the folio and going, I mean, in my mind, it's not that long of a book, and my mind just exploded with everything I could be doing with it. I think for me, one of the reasons I've always been more of a Greyhawk fan compared to, I love Forgotten Realms, but Forgotten Realms is really this kind of second or third wave fantasy, especially by the time you hit like second edition, where it's super ultra high magic. And I think what I loved about, Greyhawk was that it felt like the history books I was reading. Like, I could see what was going on. And I know Gary mentions in one of them that magic is going away. It's not as potent as it once was, and so we have this decline of magic. So it's rarer when you find things. It's more special. It's not just kind of, how do I want to put this? I don't want to say it's not low fantasy, but it's much more of like a traditional classic fantasy than kind of the high fantasy that we now see throughout Dungeons and Dragons.
It's really Greyhawk. You're right that it's extremely hard to quantify because it somehow captures this. It's really like a literary map, sort of. It captures this juxtaposition between the Hobbit cartoon and that kind of really colorful, fantastic stuff with Darlene's colorful map. And
Yeah.
but yet her calligraphy is so beautiful that it looks medieval. So you've got this kind of touch of history about it. And then when you get in, and like you, I used the folio. I barely used the box sets that came later.
Yeah.
Davis in the late 70s and early 80s when we were gaming so heavily together before we got our own groups. And Davis is my brother.
Yeah.
He bought everything, absolutely everything. And he bought that folio, read it, and then just set it aside and kept creating his own world. Well, I got that folio and just absolutely, absolutely fell in love with that thing. And you're right. There's something about the write-ups. They're so simple, yet they give you enough information to unlock your imagination and go. And it's really just kind of a history of the Great Kingdom or a history of Keelland or whatever, with a little bit of just a little spice in there to let you go. And then it's your map. It's
Yeah.
all yours. You can do whatever you want with it, be it high magic, low magic,
Yeah.
fading magic, whatever it is you want to do. And I think that was its strength, but there's something that I guess maybe right time, right place type thing for people like you and I. It was the setting. It was the
Yeah.
go-to.
Yeah.
It had this magic. It's like when I watched The Hobbit, the cartoon Hobbit.
Yeah.
There's just something about that Hobbit. It's just really cool.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I don't know what it is.
Yeah, it's the right place, right time thing. It was lightning in a bottle for me. Like it opened my brain to heraldry, all of the heraldry that they had on the inside of that folio. Leach has commented that he's running his Castles and Crusade campaign in its infancy as a continuation of the Greyhawk campaign that he played in the early 80s to mid 90s, and that Castles and Crusades and Greyhawk fit together flawlessly. And John Doom, who's a friend of the show, he managed to play in a bit of a Saltmarsh campaign, and the world seemed really awesome. It is, John. We should play more Greyhawk.
There's just something about it, and the way it was presented, really, it gives you, I don't know, it's just a playing field, and it actually there's so much Normeal. There's so much inspiration that came out of Greyhawk and spilled into this. This is the world.
That's where I was going to go next. Like, so I've got the Codex Aihrde here. This is an homage. I mean, it's yours, and you did a great job with it. But I can see where there are touchstones and homages to Greyhawk. Do you want to talk about this?
So I played Greyhawk forever and a day. When Davis gave me his copy of the folio, I started running games in it. And then when I moved to Jonesboro, Arkansas, I hooked up with a guy named Todd Gray, Matt Golden, Charlie Sifford. There's a few of us, and we started gaming. And I started playing it. I just used Greyhawk. It was all Greyhawk. I had the maps, coded, the whole thing. I've got those things somewhere around here. And we played in that all through our college years, into my graduate studies. The whole onions. We kept playing this one game, and then, but there was things about Greyhawk that I wanted to change. I wanted to change the populations, and all that was easy to do. You could do any of that stuff, and I began to altering just this bits and pieces of it. Now, when the first Gulf War broke out, I enlisted in the Army, and so I go off to war. And at the time, everyone thought it was going to be a big war. Turned out it was not a big war. It ended relatively quickly. I think 100 hours or so. So by the time I was through training, the war was over, and I ended up serving the better part of my 3 years in Hawaii, which was not a terribly difficult post.
Oh man,
twist
my arm there.
Right, So I had a whole lot of time on. I was commo too, so I had a lot of time on my hands. So I began. I would sit in the office, and we had played in Greyhawk, and when I enlisted, we closed the game down. We ended this epic game where they were fighting this creature called Darkness. I took inspiration from the movie Legend. And it ends, when the game ends, Darkness has stepped through this mirror and he's conquering the world of Greyhawk. and the whole 9 yards. If you look at the early notes, it's all Greyhawk. All of it's Greyhawk stuff. So when I get into the army, and
Can I interrupt you right there real quick?
yeah, yeah,
Because I think I heard an interview where you said that darkness stepped through the mirror because of your players' actions. They
yeah.
had the chance to destroy it, and
There was a huge role playing encounter. We've been playing this particular campaign for over a year easily. Same characters for 5 or 6 years or whatever it was. We started in 85 and this is going to be 91, so 6 years. So they end up in Roxy's in the Great Kingdom's capital there, and the Emperor is. They know he's going to summon this creature. They don't know what, and there's this huge role playing session. Well, the mirror behind the throne is the gateway, is the portal from which Unklar, the dark god's going to step through. And all they had to do was break that mirror. And it almost got into a fight with the Emperor, but they didn't do that, and they leave the hall. So Unklar steps through the mirror and proceeds to conquer the world. So I scattered their characters just before I went into the army and put them all in places of rest.
yeah,
Todd goes to the Gleaming Sea, this, that, because we didn't know what was going to happen to me when I'm overseas, blah, blah, blah. End up in Hawaii, of course. So then I wrote this novel while I was sitting over there. I took that novel and I began to mesh it with the campaign. And then I began to just change everything. I started writing the guys these letters. When I get out of the army, we're going to pick the game back up. It's going to be 1,000 years later after the Millennial Dark. And I began to change just so much of it. I began to and I just kind of left Greyhawk behind and created the world of Aihrde while I was in the army and post army. But like you said, there's real touchstones. There's things
yeah,
you can't get away from. I mean, Keelan and Kaomar, the Darkened
right,
Throne, Redwood, and then if you look at Alfstrag on my map, that was the original Roxy's, the Great Kingdom. There's two rivers that come together.
yep.
There's Roxy's. There's Alfstrag. There's things I just couldn't let go of.
I have poured over Darlene's maps of Greyhawk more than I have poured over. I mean, I think the only maps that I am more familiar with than Darlene's map, I wrote a fantasy Bronze Age game called Jackals, and it's set in kind of a fantasy adjacent version of the ancient Near East. So like I've poured over like Mycenaean Greek and the Hittite maps and Kadesh, and studying like my I'll know I've made it when I can set up and field the Hittites versus the Egyptians and recreate the Battle of Kadesh, on my
Right.
sandboard. But aside, like I don't, my normal geography does not. The lands I spend most time in are Greyhawk and the ancient Near East. So like, ask me how to get from Dallas to Chicago. I'll kind of point and be like, I guess that way. Like, by the way, thank you so much. Trollord has rated us with 20 people. This is fantastic. Thanks for joining.
Grace, that's Crane Writes that Grace was reading from Aired on our channel just a little while ago.
Oh, excellent.
Yes, every Monday she does a reading from fiction I've written or pieces from the Codex of Aired or other bits and pieces from Aired. So it's
I
always
just saw that on your Instagram today, and I've set reminders to watch. I was like, I'll watch tonight. Wait, no, I'm actually chatting with Steve tonight. I can't do that.
I got to apologize to Grace. I completely forgot when I was talking to you about this show. Chuck normally handles all this, and I didn't tell Chuck about any of it. So,
we'll definitely do another one of these because this is a ton of fun. Well, do you want to talk about Aihrde real quick and kind of bring our initial discussion to the close? Because I love Aihrde. Aihrde was actually why I got into Castles and Crusades. I got someone gave me. It was one of those Christmas parties where you got to find something to give to the person on your the name that you drew out of the hat, and the only thing that I was working at a title company, and the only thing they knew about me was that I loved role-playing games. I always had a role-playing book. And so they just went down to my local game store and they're like, I need something. Here's my budget. And lo and behold, they showed up with the Codex Aihrde.
That's wild.
And I was like, what is this? And so let's talk about Aihrde.
So Aihrde, Aihrde is the world's, it's the de facto world setting for Castles and Crusades, but it actually came before CNC. When we first published it as the After Winter Dark fantasy campaign setting, a small 28 or 24 page book that was heavily inspired in its presentation, its content as well, but in its presentation by the folio
Yeah.
edition of Greyhawk. And when you, I think I got one of those here. When you look at, yeah, so here was the original publication, the After Winter Dark, little bitty 24 page guy. And I looked at Greyhawk, and one of the things that I loved about Greyhawk is it, like we were talking earlier, it allowed me to do whatever I wanted
Mm-hmm.
to do. Gary gave me a little bit of stuff. Here's your, your starter. Now go. So I wanted to replicate that. Now, what Greyhawk didn't do that was frustrating to me is it didn't give me the prehistory to everything that I had there. So
Yeah.
I started creating prehistories for that stuff. And when you're running characters like elves or dwarves that are 180 years old, they kind of know what happened 180 years ago. And there was these little bitty things that they had given us, but not a whole lot. So I decided to go when I began designing it, and this really began in the army when I started writing all these letters. I said, okay, Unclar's conquered the plane and he's created the millennial darkness. But what led up to this? So then I began, and I have a huge love of dwarves. It's my favorite of the races. So I made dwarves kind of the baseline, and I began creating from there, creating a mythology, the whole 9 yards. So in this book, it's only like 10 pages, maybe 4 or 5 pages, something like that. It gives you the background that leads up to the Winter Dark. The true strength, one of the true strengths in Greyhawk, I wanted to carry over to Aihrde was here's where you go, here's where you are, here's all your players, now you go. So I didn't want to create heroes that the players have to play in the shadow of. I didn't want to create these thematic elements that you have to go and fight, this dark god or that dark god. That's all done. The god has been overthrown, the
Mm-hmm.
millennial darkness is over, the world is yours, it's 90 years fresh. And I'll do a quick spiel on the world itself, but it's 90 years fresh for you to just do as a CKN player to do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Here's your kingdoms, go. But what you have is 12,000 years of history, more than that, really, that you can rely on to build whatever you're doing. So the premise behind the world of Aihrde, the Allfather appears on the Void, and he just begins creating stuff. His only real passion is to create. He just creates and creates and creates. He has no other motivation beyond that. He creates all these kind of creatures. One kind of comes of his dark thoughts, and he's kind of disgusted by it, so he pushes it aside. Then he creates what are called the Valor Kun. These are the first of the gods. They actually make war on that dark thought and drive it into the Undeeps, and that is Unclar. It's driven off, and then these other gods, the three of them, Mordias, and then Corthane and Orandul, they all look upon the Allfather and they want some kind of meaning from him. But he has
There's
there's
no
no
meaning to be had.
meaning to be had. He's trying to make something. It's in his mind and he can't quite figure out. And so the gods are actually flawed things. He created them, didn't like it, threw them aside. And he just keeps doing this. Well, at a certain point, he sees this on the Void. He sees this spinning, burning ball of flame. He goes to investigate it, and this is the dragon goddess Inzea. And she's torn, and she's equal to him, except she doesn't like to create things like he does. She likes to destroy things. So she rips the firmament apart, and all of this, the maelstrom spills into it, and that's your elements and all that stuff. Well, the Allfather has a great idea. He's like, oh, wait a minute, I can do all kinds of crap with this. So then he really starts creating, and he creates the world of Aihrde. He creates this kind of sandbox that he's playing in, and he just starts making stuff constantly. And Zaya sees what he does, and she tries to mimic it, but she does it kind of in a flawed way, and this not really evil, but a darker way. She creates, his world is flat. She creates kind of this cup underneath it. It's her world below. So he begins to create. Eventually, he creates the dwarves. And that's what he wanted to create. Once he creates the dwarves, he's kind of finished. But they too turn to him and they want some kind of, what's the meaning? And one of their heroes says that to him, and he just looks at him and he doesn't say anything. And he just goes back to his forge, making more stuff. And that's what the dwarves think. Oh, that's the Andanuth. It's the oath. That's what the Allfather wants us to do, is just create, whether it's good actions or good products or whatever it is. So the dwarves become obsessed with mining and doing all this other stuff. This leads them into wars with the gods. This leads to all kinds of stuff. And one of the gods, Orandul, one of the named the Valar, he becomes kind of enraged at the dwarves, starts taking certain members of them, poisoning them with thoughts and deeds, and creates the goblins. And the goblins go to war with the dwarves. This goes on for 4,000 years, this long, long war between these two peoples. Eventually, they're overthrown, but out of the goblin mess comes sorcery. Humans who are meandering around at this point adopt sorcery, and then the age of sorcerers begins. And that's really the age of Greyhawk in my game,
Okay.
because this is where Luther and all of these players come up. They end up summoning this dark god from the Undeeps, who is Unklar, the one that was driven away in the beginning. He shows up, conquers the world. Then they have to overthrow Unklar. This takes 1,000 years for them to do that. They overthrow Unklar, drive him out, and that was my campaign that I played at the table for so many years. And then, because once I got out of the army in '93 or '4, whatever that was, we picked the game back up, and started playing it again. So, and I think they finally threw Unklar out in 2003. No, that can't be right. It had to have been before publication. 2001, something like that. Somewhere around. I'd have to ask Mac. But so once Unklar conquers the world, he rules for 1,000 years. He's overthrown, and now it's 60 years later, and the remnants of these ancient kingdoms are popping up, but there's not much memory of what was before. So it's just these old ruins, dungeons, these ancient texts, these scrolls tucked away, and old castles and whatnot. And this is the playing field that you get to step into and do whatever you want to with it. You can alter it and change it. There's no real thing here that is set in stone. No, you don't have to mess with Unklar or Orandul or any of the gods.
Right.
You can do whatever, and go with it. So that's the setting in a nutshell.
Well, and I love that it's primed for something for the players to do, with no meta plot planned to go forward.
Right.
Like you have created a setting that's on the cusp of action, and given it over to players and GMs. I mean, the A series is fantastic. The C series is amazing. I know you have other adventures and campaigns to be set in the world of Aihrde, but it's not necessarily planned to be earth-shattering events. Like, we're not going to have the Avatar crisis like they did in Forgotten Realms. Or I could just throw a dart at a '90s game publishing company, hit a meta plot, kind of a thing.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that's a great way to put it. There are no meta plots other than those that you bring in, and a perfect example of that. There's it's somewhere in the mythologies. Orandul slays his sister Mordias. Now these are both named Valar, and the named Valar are the most powerful of gods. Well, Mordias rises up in this haze of blood. He gathers the blood up and makes a cloak of it. It's called the Cloak of Red. Now later, this Cloak of Red is disintegrated by the god Frafnod, and it's just blown into the smithereens. Well, when we started a game about 3 years ago, my Sunday game, one of the players said, "Hey, I was reading the codex. I want to find this Cloak of Red." I was like, "Well, it was destroyed. It was scattered all over the world. I want to find each piece of it and reassemble it." And I thought, okay, there's the campaign.
I mean, that's
what it is. He created his own meta plot, but I had nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it was just, he took a piece of the mythology and said, "I want to do this," and we ran with it.
Those are the best kind of players. The ones that are proactive. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love all the players in my game.
Yeah.
Especially if you're watching this, know that I love you. But I really appreciate, as a GM, a player who says, "There's this cool thing that you put in your book or in your write-up. I want to know about this."
Yep.
And
it makes a game.
Yeah. I mean, I assume, the Trollord Discord is hopping. I assume that do you take the same joy that I do when people are like, "Hey, here's what I'm doing with this thing that you put in your world," and they share a little bit about their campaign?
Oh, absolutely. I was in a panel at Game Hall with some other publishers, and one of the questions was, how do you respond to people who take what you created and change it into something that you didn't envision? I absolutely love it. I absolutely love it. And I got to say, we had my first, I guess she ran about 6 games on our Twitch channel. We'd hired this young lady to run just some stuff. And here's the material, go play. And they played Aihrde in this very lighthearted, funny, costumey. Taken like the Eldritch goblins are this really ancient goblins.
Hmm.
Those first dwarves that Orndul and that he coaxed to become evil. Those are the Eldritch goblins. If Orndul touched one, they're immortal. So many of these Eldritch goblins are thousands and thousands of years old. Some steeped in evil, some not. But they took the Eldritch goblin and turned it into this kind of funny thing. And at first I was like, what the? And then I thought, that's actually kind of cool. Because why not? Right? I mean, but they took it and they ran with it and they made it theirs. And I think it's the highest compliment, to be honest
Yeah.
with you. If you can take something that Trollord has published and created and make it your own and have a ball with it, then we're 100% behind it. I love it.
Awesome. Well,
I will
Steve,
say, I want to say real quick,
oh yeah,
D. Kingsley said Aihrde is also Venus in the solar system according to
yes,
Solar Burn. So that was one of the long-standing things that I didn't let out until about a year or so ago, when we began overhauling Amazing Adventures. Aihrde is actually Venus, so that the way we've tied the cosmologies together, if you were to leave Earth today and go to Venus and somehow survive the horrific,
yeah,
you know,
the
acid or
horrific
whatever,
pressure and heat, yeah.
yeah, the terrible environment, you would find the ruins of these ancient cities beneath the dust of Venus. And it creates this nice modern day connection between the two.
Which again, if you go back to the fantasy that sort of inspired us, that was, I mean, John Carter of Mars,
Yep.
Worm Ouroboros, right?
Yep.
Which is always the weirdest part of that story to me, that it starts off with a guy being taken away from Earth, and then about 30 pages into it, the author completely drops that character and focuses on the demons. And I'm like, but what about that guy? That guy that,
He was bored with that guy.
yeah, fair. But this idea that it's all alternate history, it's
Yeah.
all out there in the solar system. We just need to find a way to connect with it. I love
Yeah.
that.
I love in the Airdine mythology, there's what's called the Gonfod, and it's
Yeah.
when two of the gods, Orndul and Corthane, will fight in the end over whose vision is true. Well, in the Gonfod, the world's destroyed because these guys are really powerful.
Yeah.
And that's Venus. Like Kingsley said, he flips it on its rotation. It just destroys the planet. So you can easily connect that if you're playing Amazing Adventures or any other games you're doing. You can easily connect the two, and then go to town with it. And I love that concept because I'm a huge fan of pulp. I'm a huge fan of that. You know, the old John Carter's, the Carson of Venus, all of that
Hmm.
stuff where, you know, in the 19, we were talking about my son and I, who's big into astronomy. We were talking about this the other day. In 1910, when you're looking up, or 1920, when you're looking up skies, we didn't know all this stuff, right? There
No.
was still the canals on Mars, and Venus might be habitable. We didn't know completely. So I love the mystery that existed then that we've kind of left behind. Maybe, who knows? Who
Yeah.
knows what's beyond the clouds of Venus? But you know, it's a little bit gone. But it's nice to revisit that and that kind of concept.
My son, we just finished. We every morning as he's getting ready for school, we read something together, and then we listen to Tolkien on the drive in. His choice is always Tolkien. We just Silmarillion, Children of Hurin, Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, repeat since he
Nice.
was in kindergarten. But so we just finished. We did the space C.S. Lewis's space trilogy. Speaking of going to Venus, and then we did Howard, and I was like, well, what do you want to read next? And he's 11 and a half. He's like, I really want to read Lovecraft. And so
Oh,
we're reading through Lovecraft, and we're in the Whisper in the Darkness, and they're talking about how Yuggoth is this mysterious ninth planet that no one really knows about yet, but that, you know, the Migos agents will reveal to Earth scientists. And I'm like, even that had this sense of, hey, there's other things out there that we just
right.
don't understand.
Yeah, and I love that. And I don't think it's completely lost, but we think it's completely lost. You know,
Yes.
we think we have all this information in our hands. I'm a big UFO guy, so I like the mysteries, and I
I
want to
see your I
believe.
want to believe poster behind
Yeah,
you.
no matter what, I'm gonna.
Yeah.
I will fight the evidence to the bitter end. So, but yeah, I think that and Lovecraft is a perfect, you know, is really the guy for that. The
Yeah.
guy that captures that otherness, that primordial fear that we all have, no matter
Yeah.
what. Because you know, no matter what answers we have, when you're going out in the dark and you hear a noise, you don't know what it is. You know,
Yeah. It's
unnerving.
I was at a panel at Chaosium Con, and they were talking about how everything at Chaosium is really focused on myth. And somebody was like, "Well, how do you define Lovecraft as myth?" And they're like, "Oh, it's the anti-myth. It's that if you leave your house and you go on the hero's journey, you're either going to die or you're going to come back insane." I was like, "Oh, yeah, it's sort of the inverse of Campbell's
True.
like hero's journey." Um, well, Steve, thank you so much for joining. Like, this was awesome. I would love to do more of these going
Should be
forward.
great.
Awesome.
Anytime.
We'll get another one set up. I am going to be for those of you who have joined from the Troll Lord channel here on Iconic Production in January. We're dedicating the entire month to Castles and Crusades, and we're going to do a deep dive on the products, the adventures, stuff you guys already know. But if you want to come join us and cheer people on as they learn about Castles and Crusades, that would be amazing. We're going to be doing more of these Beyond the Tables. I think I have 2 more scheduled for December once I get those dates set up and guests dialed in. I will share that. But Steve, I would love to chat with you again. This was awesome. Thanks for coming and joining us.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
All right, well, guys, we'll be back with more Beyond the Table at some point in December. Stay tuned on the Twitch calendar, on Twitter, on the Discord channel. Join us there. And until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. Go out and play some Castles and Crusades. Let us know what you think about it. And until next time, have a good one.
Thanks a lot, everybody.